You got really started in this at a young age, right?
Yeah, I was about 6 when I started, which is not unusual. It's a fun sport for little kids, and you have to remember, I was starting in the '70s. This was just a few years after Title IX had passed, which gave girls and young women kind of equal opportunity to play sports and do sports in college. There weren't a ton of options for girls in sports. I was sort of choosing between dance, cheerleading, and gymnastics. And Nadia Comaneci hit the stage and the world stage in 1976, and I was completely enamored,
Right.
as one was, because she was a kid. She was 14 years old, and we all related to her. And I was doing sort of rec classes at the time, but then I just became completely obsessed with gymnastics. But we didn't have other choices. There weren't soccer teams and all this other stuff that my daughter can play anything my son plays. Those opportunities weren't really there in 1976.
Yeah. When did you know that it was more than a sport, a hobby, an interest, that it was a real life passion for you?
It sounds crazy to say it, but I was probably 7. I mean, I loved it so much. And the thing about gymnastics, which is becoming less true, which I'm grateful for, is it was always viewed as a sort of young, or at least as when I did a young girl sport, a child sport. And so you had this very narrow window of opportunity. It was sort of viewed that you couldn't really do it past 16 or 17. And so the intensity started very young. And so by 7, I was going 4 days a week for 2 or 3 hours at a time at 7 years old, which seems kind of insane. And I started competing at 7, and I made elite, which is the highest level that you compete for a spot on the national team, by the time I was 10.
Wow. I've known some gymnasts that have done that sort of thing, and I watched what it did to them and to their families, making sacrifices, actually moving to get them to coaches and all of that. It affects a lot. It affects everybody in the family.
It absolutely does. And I think, I had some challenges with my family as I left the sport for a long time. But as I look back now, and as a parent myself, I think I was a very difficult child to parent. I was very driven. I wanted to go to the next level. I wanted to go to the next club, and I wanted to, it wasn't enough to make the national team. I wanted to be in the top 6. Like, I don't know what you do with a kid like this. And my parents did absolutely everything they could to support me. Now, one could argue they went too far, because the entire family then sort of revolved around me doing this sport. And when it became a bad situation for me, and I was very physically damaged and emotionally just falling apart, and I wanted to leave, that was just unthinkable at that point for my family, because they'd sacrificed so
Yeah, they
much.
put so much into it, and it's like, now you want to quit? Are you kidding me? It's hard for them to wrap their head around.
It is, and I understand that. But if you can't see what's happening to your child right in front of your face when she is just disintegrating, and I mean, I was suicidal. It was horrible. But and to not be able to see that and put your child first, I think I would caution any family to put any child's activities at the center of that entire family's existence. It's too much pressure for the kid. I don't know how you find that balance of support, but not, derangement and having it take over the entire family's life. So yeah, it got tough towards the end. It was a ton of fun until it wasn't. I had a lot of injuries. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years. I broke my femur at the World Championships. I kept coming back. But that kind of those serious injuries and the pain, because I always came back before I was fully healed, existing in that much pain and training with that much pain wears on the psyche, as you might imagine. And then eating disorders are rampant in the sport as well.
Yeah, because you get told a lot, you're fat when you're not, you got to be small. It gets really pushed on you.
Yeah, we were weighed in twice a day. Our weight was announced over the loudspeaker. We were shamed and called horrible names for gaining a quarter of a pound. The bullying and fat shaming is sort of incomprehensible to me now. And I thought in my teenage brain, these behaviors that I was adopting, because I was told lose 3 pounds by tomorrow or you can't go to the competition. And keep in mind, I was, 98 pounds and 17 years old at this point. I thought I could manage the behaviors. I thought it was sort of situational, and that once I left the sport, I'd be normal. But of course, that's not what happens. You internalize all these beliefs about yourself. And I struggled with an eating disorder for many years after I left the sport.
Yeah, it's hard to just turn that off because it just becomes part of who you are
How you see
and your
yourself.
lifestyle.
Yeah.
You say your parents got tunnel vision, just refused to notice this downward spiral that was going on because they were so focused on, really, in one sense, trying to get you what you wanted, but they had so much invested in it. I guess there's so much conflict, they can't see what's going on. They don't want to see it, can't see it, don't see it.
Yeah, all that. It's a good description. And we were so embedded in this community. I mean, my mom worked in the gym at the front desk. You know, her identity was very much tied to me being one of the best kids in the gym all the time. We moved our family from New Jersey to Allentown, Pennsylvania. I initially moved by myself and lived with a coach at 14. That was too difficult. My mother moved. Then the whole family moved. So we reorchestrated our entire lives around my gymnastics. And that's a lot of sacrifice for parents. I would just, it's hard. You know, hindsight's 2020. You know, I would say I wouldn't do that right now for one of my kids. I think it's too much pressure for a child. I don't think it's healthy for the family dynamic, but I don't fault them for it. They were trying to be supportive.
Right, of course. Is it your fear that this kind of thing is still going on today in gymnastics?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we didn't get to it, but I wrote a book in 2008 called Chalked Up, which was a memoir about my time in gymnastics. I continued to suffer from basically what was a culture of abuse, you know, extreme emotional, physical abuse. There is sexual abuse, as we now know, because of the case of Larry Nassar, but it was very prevalent and present when I was doing it as well. The national team coach in the 80s, the Olympic coach, is now banned from the sport for sexually assaulting athletes on the national team. This was the environment that we grew up in, and I continued to struggle with that into my 30s, and I eventually wrote a book about it. Now, I did not realize how controversial it would be. I thought all of this was an open secret, not a secret that we weren't allowed to talk about, although I should have gleaned that. And so it was not the first time I've been dragged on the internet and called horrible names. Now, it was in a smaller, tinier community before. It was sort of gymnastics and the larger youth sports movement. But I was deemed a liar and a grifter, just sort of bitter about not making the Olympics and out to make a buck and, you know, dragging these good men through the mud, these coaches who abused young children for no reason. That I endured for 10 years.
Well, right. The book Chalked Up really pulled the curtain back on all of that. You did receive a lot of praise for the book as well, but you were attacked. And as you say, people were just saying, oh, just sour grapes because you didn't get what you wanted. So now you wanted to trash the sport.
That was basically the assessment. Most of that was coming from inside the community because I was criticizing our community. People outside, it was sort of more accepting. You know, I shined a light. They watched gymnastics every 4 years at the Olympics. They thought it was really cool. And these bouncy little cute girls were jumping around and they were like, oh, I never thought it was that bad. Like, they didn't necessarily question my accounting of it, but inside the sport, I was essentially excommunicated. But, you know, it's not just being called names on the internet, you know, being threatened with lawsuits, and I had to cancel readings because there was violence that was threatened and all of these kinds of things. So it's fine. I got through it. I think the thing that still doesn't sit right with me is, you know, Larry Nassar, and I know you had Judge Ekelina on recently. I think you spoke with her recently, but Larry Nassar, who was the Team USA gymnastics doctor for 30 years, went to prison for life for abusing, you know, hundreds and hundreds of young athletes. And when that story broke, it implicated the entire sport and the culture because he was harbored, aided, and abetted by the leaders in the sport. And so now suddenly we were allowed to talk about this. And everyone who came at me said, oh, we always stood with you, which is a lie.
Yeah.
Welcome to the fight, but it's not true. But someone has to go first. Someone has to say a thing first.
You obviously are a woman of great determination. You have the ability to discipline, set an objective, stay with it, go after it. And when you wrote Chalked Up, you were an outcast, ostracized by the community. And I've really looked at what happened after that book, what some of the comments and feedback really, where it came from and what it was. And the people that were saying a lot of the things they were saying knew damn well that what you were saying was true. They, in fact, were experiencing what you were calling out, but yet they were closing ranks because I guess once you're in the middle of it, it's like cognitive dissonance. You have to justify it in your own mind in order to continue to go through it. You have to find some way to make it okay. But it was so ironic that a lot of the people that were yelling the loudest were actually suffering what you were talking about the suffering being.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, I think that's one of the great sort of ironies and one of the most harmful aspects is that, I mean, it's almost cult-like. So you're conditioned as an athlete to believe that it's your fault. If you are feeling pain, emotional, physical, it's your fault. If you think you're hungry and they're screaming at you that you ate too much and you're fat, it's your fault because you ate too much. If you are limping around on a broken ankle and trying to train and you're told you're a lazy piece of garbage, it's your fault. You're not injured, you're lazy. And so you internalize this shame and it's all your fault. And you carry that with you beyond the sport, just like the eating disorder. And so, yes, those that close ranks, they were suffering that same sort of conditioning that they believed it was them. Now, I think what's really interesting is the film that I produced, which you referenced, Athlete A, which came out in 2020. What I really wanted to do was connect the Nassar story to the larger culture of abuse. And it prompted this outpouring of young athletes around the world and retired athletes telling their stories of abuse. And the letters that I got, emails, I guess is more accurate, I didn't even know this was abuse. I knew I was suffering, but I didn't connect it. I would hear the most egregious stories about sexual assault, and I thought, oh, lucky, I did not go through that. But for them, the way it was laid out in the film, they realized that their continued suffering was a result of this emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, and they could name it finally.